Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with a new tutorial. This is going to be a Blender tutorial, and we're going to cover a very simple VFX shot in a short film that I made for the purposes of practicing and demonstrating some film scoring, scoring music to picture using open source free software on Linux. And the last film that I made did involve one VFX shot, so we're going to look at that Blender side of things here today very quickly. So this is the actual short film, and I have the sound turned off here because we're going to deal with the sound separately on other tutorials, the music and the scoring. You can see this video montage of these various clips of this ruined building, this house that's been it's dilapidated, kind of structure, fallen apart somewhere out in the countryside. And the VFX shot in question is way out here at the end. You'll see there is this shot of this doll, this broken, ruined doll here. This is not actually a video clip. This is a Blender scene that's been set up. I could not find any footage like this in the royalty-free stock footage that I was using, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk a little bit about how to make a movie from royalty-free stock footage and places where you can get that. We've discussed this in the past, but I'll cover that again in a moment. I couldn't find a shot of anything like this. All I had were these shots of the structure that seemed to go together. They all seemed to be at the same place from the library that I took from. But I wanted to be able to tell a story, not just with the music, but actually be able to lead up to something that had a bit of a narrative and gave it a bit of a character. And of course, there's not a lot of character here just in the shots of the building itself. So I wanted something of some kind of personality or characterization, and I thought, well, maybe a broken doll would work well, kind of a destroyed China doll or something like that. So I wanted a shot sort of like this, and I couldn't find any. So I thought, well, I have 3D software, I'll just make one. So what I did was I created this shot using a camera projection and a still photograph, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what I was really after was this kind of creep out moment right at the very end. You can watch as we play through this last shot. Right at the end, as it fades out, you get this kind of Hitchcockian, this Alfred Hitchcock moment. And I'll pause it right here where you see this skull in the fade out. It sort of appears in the place proportionally where this doll's head was at. And I wanted to have that moment and have the music leading up to this moment, just to give it a little bit more of a narrative, kind of a direction that it was heading, or a climactic point where the video would conclude, so that it would give a little bit more meaning to the film. Rather than just a montage of images and music. I wanted to have some kind of narrative to it. And that's probably something you want to do if you're creating or you're shooting your own, silent film with music, or if you are using, as I'm doing here, just some royalty-free stock footage to make it. And then one other note here too, just titles. Simple kind of title here I just made using text and GIMP. The titles at the end. I've been doing this a lot lately too, where when I'm creating a film or a short or something like this, I put the title at the end and try to refrain from using titles at the beginning, just rather get right into it. It was an interesting tip that I saw. I can't remember where I first saw that from, but I thought it was a really good tip that helps to make your amateur film not look like it's pretending to be something that it isn't. There's a tendency, I think, for short filmmakers, YouTube kind of content creation, to put titles at the beginning, much like a serial TV show or a feature film or something like that, pretending to be something that it really isn't. It's just a very short, couple minute little montage, I don't need to have a bunch of bloated titles anywhere. I can get right to the point and just let it be what it is, and just stick the title right at the end for the impact that it needs, and then of course just the basic crediting that I need at the very end. So titles made in GIMP. And also some of these textures that we're going to be dealing with here also done in GIMP. So let's get into it. First of all, I needed some video footage, so I'll just cover that discussion here right now because most of the other tutorials on this are going to deal with the music side. Let's just get the video stuff out of the way as we're looking at this VFX shot. You can get royalty-free stock footage from Pixabay without having to make an account. You do not need to create an account. You can actually download without creating an account from Pixabay. Pixabay deals mostly with images, but they actually have a videos section. You can see here that you can get videos or vector graphics even in photos. So vector graphics would have scalable type platform that you can use in a vector graphics editor. Which GIMP is not. GIMP is a photo editor, but you could use it in another type of editor that deals with vector graphics like Blender does. I went to the video section and I just searched for, here I wrote in ruins. I think I was searching for something else and I just came across all of these shots that seemed to be of the same location, and there were just so many of them. I thought, well, I could put this together and make a pretty, interesting short film. They have some green screen footage that you can use if you wanted to create some VFX shot or do some tests or whatnot. There are some, all kinds of different kinds of video options in there, and again, you can put in search terms. There's also some patroning going on here to Shutterstock, so it'll give you some sponsored videos for Shutterstock, which is a paid service that you can link to if you see anything that you really like there. Here's some stock elements that you could download with a fee, and then the royalty-free stock stuff down here. It will indicate what the attribution is whenever you click on it, and then you can download it at a variety of available sizes and formats. So anyway, that's Pixabay. So I downloaded all these videos, these short little clips, put together my movie without any consideration for the music. I just wanted to tell a story. And then I needed again, like I said, I couldn't find a shot of a doll that would really fit. So I went on Pixabay under images. I found this one. So you can see there's other doll images there. But this was really exactly what I was looking for. It's kind of a dirty sort of environment that matched the footage that I was using for the rest of the short film. And then here's this broken doll's head. And I thought this was perfect. This would match up perfectly. It would fit in perfectly if I could somehow animate this so that there was a camera move and a third dimension to this, so that I could get camera motion and parallax motion out of it. So I just downloaded this image, and then I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to do this overlay. So I did a quick Google image search, and I set it for the tools under the tool setting, labeled for reuse with modification, so I could know that I was downloading something with a royalty-free license or simple attribution, but I could use it and I would not have to pay a fee for it. So I found this one. I found this skull, and if you look, this is actually a 3D. It looks like a 3D image. This is a 3D model that has been rendered out. Pretty good rendering here, and it seemed to be in approximately the same kind of angle and perspective as my doll. So you see we're looking kind of on the right side as we're facing it, rather the doll's left side, but the right side, and sort of underneath, so we're looking under the chin. And this was the skull image that seemed to fit that same exact image. Could have done one from the left side and just reversed it. That would have been fine too, but I found this one and it seemed to work. So I downloaded this image. And then what I did is I took my images into GIMP and I overlaid them. So you can see here I have an overlay of my skull image, and I used my movement tools here, my rotation tools. You can see there's rotation tools. Again, you can use any photo editor that you want, my scale tools. and I turned down the opacity on my overlay, and I rotated it into place, and then I changed it and stretched it until I got it to fit sort of over this doll. And then what I did is I blackened out. I just used a paint tool, generic paint tool, soft edge, and I darkened out the areas that didn't really fit over the face of this doll, especially over here where there's a chunk missing, so that it would be blackened out and masked out, so that I could crossfade this in video and it would sort of turn into the skull figure. It would look like it was sort of underlaying or it was in the same exact state, same location as this little doll's head. So I got these two plates. I increased the contrast so that it would kind of darken up the shadows a little bit, and that was it. So I made my overlays. Then I exported each one of these as just a PNG image. So I exported the doll, and I exported the skull image as two separate images, and then I took these into Blender. So let's take a quick look at this Blender scene. Now what you're looking at here is a plane with a sort of very basic mesh underneath, and this has actually been joined together, and if we select this here and I enable my mesh, you can see what the mesh looks like. Now this is actually joined together as one piece. What this is actually a series of metaballs. So if we hit add, right here, so add metaball. What these things are, let me just move this up in Z space so you can see. What these are, if I duplicate this, they are a type of mesh that sort of has a liquid property to it. They attract each other and the mesh will join. So if you put a bunch of these together and you can scale them, and again move them around, you can sort of model in this way. And I saw this a long time ago, someone bringing up the idea of modeling using metaballs and just kind of moving them around until you have everything in the place that you want it. I put a couple of really big ones on there and then some smaller ones until I made this sort of image. Now what I did is I had my camera set at the same aspect ratio as the picture originally, and I just put my metaballs in place until they approximately landed where there was relief on the image. Now, it didn't have to match perfectly, I just needed to have enough relief so that I could eventually move the camera very slightly and it would map properly. Once I had that in place, I joined everything together. You can select all of the metaballs, and there is actually an option in here to change it, just to show you what that looks like. So you move it up in Z space so we can see it. So if I select this metaball and I go up to Object, we can actually alter this, convert to Mesh from curve, meta, surface, or text. So you can convert text or a curve or something like that, or metaballs, into mesh by doing that. So I selected all the metaballs and I converted them into mesh. Let me just get rid of this now. And then I joined that to my plane here, which I subdivided. Once I had that, I was able then to project from view. So I had, again, my camera set in view on this section of plane and metaball joined together. And I go to UV, and you can unwrap it or project from view. So if you hit project from view, it will then project the image proportions of your camera onto that mesh. Again, I've covered this on the channel before. This is nothing new. This is kind of an old topic. And if you have any questions about that, you can search the channel or look for Blender camera projection, and that will explain it a little bit more in detail. I don't really want to get into it because I want to move on quickly here, but it's just a basic camera projection. Now what you do once you have that is you're able then to apply a texture. Now I want to show you something about textures here. I'm going to go to the Eevee viewport shading very quickly, and you can see that my texture is applied to this. What you can do is just assign a basic material, over here in the Material tab. And then I discovered that you do not need to have any kind of special shadeless shader. Now, if you import an image as a plane, which is an add-on in Blender, you'll notice that it makes this kind of interesting, convoluted, shadeless shader for that texture if you select shadeless. I found that you don't need to do that. All you need to do in Eevee is add a texture and then add your image to it. So navigate in and load your image in, and just drop that into the surface of the material output, and it will automatically be completely shadeless. So it does not interact with any lighting in the scene. It's just a shadeless texture. Very, very simple sort of method here to get your texture set. And now you can see that with very minimal movement, this has a pretty good realism to it. This camera projection. If I move too much, you'll see that it breaks down quite a bit. You can see this is not exactly mapped perfectly onto that. It kind of is distorted. You see the nose is quite distorted. Things don't line up right. The eye doesn't line up right. But if I stay within the realm of a pretty small camera move, this looks quite realistic. If I go back to the camera viewport very quickly here, you'll see my animation. If I play it through, this is the animation that I get. So it's a very, very realistic camera projected scene that looks like it's a real object. Now, I didn't worry about doing any kind of camera projection for the other items in the scene. I just dealt with the doll head because I felt that these other things wouldn't really be noticed. The camera's not moving enough that parallax motion would be needed for these other items since they're not the focus. That if I had enough depth on this doll's head, and you notice the parallax motion on that and the camera move, that would be sufficient. And I found that it fooled me after I rendered this out. I was completely fooled by it. So what I did was I rendered from the viewport. Now, very quickly, some render settings over here. You'll notice that under the sampling, by default, it has render at 64 samples, and the viewport is only at 16. If I want to, I can change my viewport to match my render, and it would give me kind of the render quality. But I felt this was good enough because it's a shadeless texture. There's not a lot of mesh in there, and there's not a lot of motion. What I did is I just left this alone, and I rendered from the viewport. So if you click on View, you come down here to your OpenGL, where the new OpenGL render buttons are located. I just rendered from the viewport. So if I quickly render an image, you'll see how quickly that renders out. Instantaneous rendering. I just rendered my animation that way, set my render output, and rendered it out. Now, very quickly about render output, I found that this works pretty good for like YouTube type videos. I render at just minimum HD 1280 by 720, aspect ratio 24 frames, and then what I do is I just use the perceptually lossless output quality. This is an MP4, MPEG-4 output. And then I just set my codec to H.264 and perceptually lossless, good. If I need to do audio, I'll usually set the audio to AAC, which is typical for an MP4, and then the audio bitrate to 128. I think because I'm using music on this, I set my bitrate a little bit higher, just so that it would convert a little bit better on YouTube without getting a bunch of artifacts. But those are my render settings for YouTube, just low-end HD. This isn't really going to be used for anything other than just presentation here. If I was making this for television or something like that, to be viewed on a TV of moderate size, I might set it to 1080, and probably the same render settings here down here using the MP4 perceptually lossless quality. But anyway, those are my render settings. Now what I did is I rendered out like that, but then I rendered a second pass where I brought in my skull texture, and you can see if I just swap that out, you can see how that maps in. So again, turn off items here that can be seen, all the overlays, and then again render from the viewport. So I rendered out both of these animations, and you can see what this animation looks like. Now the good thing about this is that because this is on the same mesh, the skull will stick perfectly in composite to the texture that was there. It'll be a perfect match. Even though the parallax motion doesn't line up perfectly, kind of in these eye sockets and everything. You don't get the depth of that. For what we're going to be doing, it's going to be a good fit. It'll work out just fine. So I took these then into the video editor, the video sequence editor in Blender, and I composited them together. And let me just turn off this color strip here very briefly. You can see what I did is I set a point. You can already see the fade in happening. On here, you start to see the teeth from the skull. I set my fade in point to start way back here and then end a little early before we get to the last frame. You can see there's about 5 frames left or so where it's all black. It's completely blackened over top of the doll. So that it goes entirely to the skull at this point. So it's a fade effect going from the doll to the skull image. And then what I did is on top of that I placed a color, and I created a fade effect for that. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to see in the last frame, I can still barely see the doll underneath the skull, and I never really get a great look at the skull. I really only see the doll and a little bit of the skull while the whole thing is darkening out, and I never get a full bright view of that skull. What I was going for was the kind of effect where if you saw it, you would see it without missing it. You wouldn't miss it, but you might think as you see it, did I just see what I think I saw, right? So you know that you saw what you saw, but you could also think that you could have easily missed it. It's just a very, very subtle sort of transition here, and that's what I was going for. But I wanted it to be obvious enough. So really, really creepy effect here as you see the eyes sitting right inside of that socket area as it composites together. And you never really get just a view of the skull. Not until it's very, very dim and dark. At the very last moment, you can kind of just see the skull left. It's already fading out. So that was the effect that I was going for. So I composited this together, and then I rendered this out, again, perceptually lossless. Same settings, 1280p, and then I imported this into my project, and I just rendered this in, set it in as the last shot of my movie. So that is the Blender tutorial, just very basic camera projection using shadeless materials, just mapping the material directly into the material output from Eevee, and rendering using the OpenGL output here rather than the Eevee render. So again, same kind of quality. You're still getting the Eevee quality viewport rendering, just at a lower sampling rate here, which is perfect for something like this, which is shadeless and has very minimal geometry to it. So anyway, pretty simple camera projection kind of thing going on here. Something I like to do. I like to do 3D compositing, with shadeless materials. And again, we'll look more at that in the future as I come up with other Blender projects. But I figured I would give some of you Blender people out there something to go with, as I haven't been producing a lot of Blender stuff lately. Figured I'd give you something here in 2.8 using the Eevee environment, some camera projection. So in the future, there'll be a few more tutorials coming on this little project where we look at the music side of things. Next up, we're going to be looking at composing music to picture in MuseScore, which is actually a notation editor. It's a notation program to create music notation. We can do that to picture, and I'm going to show you how to do that, where we can actually look at video live and compose directly to that picture before we bring it into a MIDI sequencer. So that'll be the next phase in this little series of tutorials for this short video. So again, good luck with this and happy blending.